Miss Marple and the gift wrapped in black ribbon. Dear friends, welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ali, and it's such a pleasure to spend this time with you again tonight. I'd love to hear from you. What is the reason you enjoy listening to these cozy mysteries? And what's the most cherished gift you've ever received? Let us know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for new stories every day. Now, shall we begin? Chapter 1. The package on the doorstep. The bells of St. Mary Mead were ringing out across the frosty morning air, calling the faithful to Christmas service. When Miss Marple paused at the corner of Vicarage Lane and observed something that struck her as decidedly odd. It was not the sight of snow on the rooftops, though, that was pleasant enough in its Christmas card perfection. Nor was it the cheerful red ribbon tied to Mrs. Bantry's front gate, which she had evidently thought festive, but which gave the impression, Miss Marple reflected, of a prize bull at the county show. No, what caught her eye was the small knot of people gathered outside the Palmer house, their postures suggesting not holiday merriment, but something closer to alarm. Miss Marple adjusted her woolen gloves and continued her progress down the lane at a pace that might have appeared leisurely to the casual observer, but which was, in fact, quite purposeful. She had known the Palmer family for 20 years, ever since they'd come to St. Mary Mead when Mr. Palmer took over the management of Enbury. They were respectable people, quiet perhaps, too quiet. Miss Marple had sometimes thought, in the way that families become when they are holding something carefully inside themselves, afraid it might break if they moved too quickly. As she drew nearer, she could see Mrs. Palmer standing in the doorway, one hand pressed to her throat in a gesture that reminded Miss Marple of poor Annie Davis, who had received news of her son's death in the Great War. Same frozen quality, as if the body had not quite caught up with what the mind already knew. Mr. Palmer stood beside his wife, a tall man with greying hair and the sort of face that might have been handsome in youth, but had settled into deep lines around the mouth and eyes. He was speaking to young Dr. Haydock. The doctor's black bag sat on the doorstep beside what appeared to be a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Good morning," Miss Marple said pleasantly as she reached the gate. "I do hope nothing is amiss." "I was on my way to church when I noticed." Dr. Haydock turned, and his expression of relief was almost comical. "Miss Marple, thank goodness. Perhaps you might sit with Mrs. Palmer while I fetch something for her nerves. She's had rather a shock." "Of course," Miss Marple said, coming through the gate with the air of one who's been formally invited, though no such invitation had been extended. It was remarkable, she had found over the years, how much one could learn by being simply present at the right moment. "What has happened?" Mr. Palmer's jaw tightened. He was a man, Miss Marple noted, who did not care for questions, particularly from elderly spinsters who ought to be minding their own business. But his wife was swaying slightly, and Dr. Haydock had already disappeared into the house in search of sal volatile or brandy, or whatever young doctors prescribe these days for shock. "Someone has played a cruel joke," Mr. Palmer said shortly. His voice was clipped, the accent still carrying traces of Yorkshire despite 2 decades in the South. "A parcel left on our doorstep on Christmas morning, if you can credit such wickedness." Miss Marple looked down at the parcel. It was still partially wrapped, the brown paper torn open at one end. The paper itself was of good qualities, smooth and thick, the sort one might buy at a proper stationer rather than the village shop. But it was the ribbon that held her attention. Black ribbon, tied in an elaborate knot. "How very singular," she murmured. "May I?" Without waiting for permission, she bent down to examine the parcel more closely. The ribbon was silk, she thought, or possibly grow grain-tied with a precision that spoke of practice. The knot itself was distinctive, looped in a particular way that reminded her of something, though she could not immediately place what. "I shouldn't touch it, Miss Marple," Mr. Palmer said sharply. "The police will want to see it as it was found." "The police?" Miss Marple straightened, her mild blue eyes meeting his. "Not merely a joke." Mrs. Palmer made a small sound, something between a sob and a gasp. She was a slight woman, several years younger than her husband, with fair hair going grey at the temples and the sort of faded prettiness that suggested she had once been quite lovely. Now she looked as though she might faint at any moment. "Come inside, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, taking her arm. "You should sit down." The hallway of the Palmer house was decorated with holly and ivy, and a small Christmas tree stood in the corner of the sitting room, its candles unlit. Everything spoke of preparations made with care, of a household ready to celebrate the season. But the atmosphere was wrong, Miss Marple thought. It felt like a stage set after the actors had forgotten their lines. She guided Mrs. Palmer to the sofa and sat beside her, still holding her hand. The woman's fingers were ice cold. "Dr. Haydock will be here in a moment," Miss Marple said. "Perhaps you might tell me what was in the parcel, that is, if it won't distress you too much." Mrs. Palmer opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. No sound came out. Her eyes, Miss Marple noticed, kept darting toward the window, as if she expected to see something there or someone. It was Mr. Palmer who answered, standing in the doorway with his hands clenched at his sides. "A locket," he said. The word came out hard and flat, like a stone dropped into still water. A silver locket on a chain. Miss Marple waited. There was more. She was certain. There was always more. "It belonged to our daughter," Mrs. Palmer whispered. To Laura, the name hung in the air between them. Miss Marple knew it, of course. Everyone in St. Mary Mead knew it. Laura Palmer had vanished exactly 1 year ago, just after Christmas. There had been searches, questions, theories whispered over tea and shopping. The general consensus, carefully worded in that way people have when they wish to be kind without being untruthful, was that the girl had run away with a young man from the stables. A groom, someone unsuitable. Mr. Palmer had forbidden the match, and the girl had taken matters into her own hands. "I see," Miss Marple said quietly. "You see nothing," Mr. Palmer said, his voice rising. "Someone is trying to torment us. That young blackguard Reeves, no doubt, or one of his friends. They wish to remind us that we refuse to countenance his advances to our daughter, Colin Reeves." Miss Marple asked. She remembered him, vaguely, a dark-haired young man who had worked at Enbury. He had left the village around the same time Laura disappeared. The very same, Mr. Palmer said. A common stable hand with pretensions above his station. Dr. Haydock returned with a glass of brandy, which he pressed into Mrs. Palmer's hands. She drank it obediently, like a child taking medicine. "I've sent word to Inspector Craddock," the doctor said to Mr. Palmer. "He should be here within the hour. This is a matter for the police, not for Christmas morning gossip." The last words were directed, Miss Marple noted with some amusement, at herself. Young Dr. Haydock had his father's brisk manner, but not yet his father's wisdom about when to deploy it. "Quite right," she said placidly. "Though I wonder, Mr. Palmer, if I might ask one question." "What question?" His tone was not encouraging. The ribbon on the parcel, black ribbon, tied in rather an unusual knot. "Have you any idea where it might have come from?" Mr. Palmer stared at her. What possible difference could that make? Perhaps none at all, Miss Marple agreed. But I was reminded of something when I saw it a particular way of tying used by undertakers in the north of the county. My cousin's husband was in that trade, you see, and he once showed me the funeral knot they use for burial cords. Very distinctive, not the sort of thing one forgets. The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Palmer's hand trembled, and brandy slopped over the edge of her glass. Dr. Haydock looked sharply at Miss Marple, his expression suggesting he was reassessing his earlier dismissal, but it was Mr. Palmer's face that interested Miss Marple most. He had gone very pale, and there was something in his eyes that might have been fear. "Nonsense," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Pure coincidence." "Very possibly," Miss Marple said. She stood, gathering her gloves and handbag. "I'm afraid I shall miss the service, but under the circumstances, I'm sure the vicar will understand. Mrs. Palmer, I shall call on you this afternoon, if I may. Perhaps you might feel more the thing by then." She let herself out, leaving Dr. Haydock to tend to his patient. Outside, she paused to look once more at the parcel on the doorstep. The brown paper was expensive, the wrapping neat despite being torn. The black ribbon gleamed in the winter sunlight. It's elaborate, not perfect and precise. Whoever had left this package had taken considerable care with its presentation. This was not the work of a prankster or a vengeful lover. This was something else entirely. Miss Marple walked slowly back up the lane, no longer thinking of church bells or Christmas services. She was thinking instead of a young woman who had vanished without a trace, and of a locket that had somehow found its way home on the anniversary of her disappearance. She was thinking of Mr. Palmer's sudden pallor when she mentioned the funeral knot, and she was thinking, as she so often did, of human nature and its infinite capacity for both love and deception. In her experience, the two were not always as separate as people liked to believe. By the time she reached her cottage, Miss Marple had made up her mind. This was not a joke, and it was not a coincidence. Someone had sent that package for a reason, and the reason was connected to whatever had truly happened to Laura Palmer. The bells were still ringing, calling the faithful to worship and celebration. But in Miss Marple's mind, another bell was ringing entirely the clear, cold bell of murder. Chapter 2. A locket from the past. Inspector Craddock arrived at 11, bringing with him the brisk efficiency that Miss Marple had always found reassuring in the county police. He was a youngish man, nephew to Sir Henry Clithering, and had inherited something of his uncle's ability to listen without immediately dismissing what elderly ladies might have to say. Miss Marple had returned to her cottage just long enough to put the kettle on before presenting herself at the Palmer house once more, this time carrying a basket containing a jar of her green-gage jam and what she described as a small Madeira cake. It was remarkable, she had found, how a basket of provisions could serve as passports to almost any situation. She found the inspector in the sitting-room examining the parcel with careful attention, while Mr. Palmer stood by the window with his back to the room. Mrs. Palmer had been taken upstairs to rest, Dr. Haydock having administered a sedative. Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock said, rising as she entered. "Dr. Haydock mentioned you were present when the parcel was discovered." "Not quite discovered," Miss Marple corrected gently. "I arrived shortly afterward, but I did observe the package before it was disturbed further." "And you noticed something about the ribbon, I understand." "The knot," Miss Marple said. She set down her basket and approached the table where the parcel now lay. The locket had been removed and placed in a separate evidence bag, but the wrapping remained. "It's tied in a very particular way, sort of not used by funeral directors when securing burial garments or tying memorial ribbons. I've seen it only once or twice, but it's quite distinctive. Inspector Craddock examined the knot more closely. You're right. That's not a standard bow or even a decorative knot. It's functional, meant to hold fast. Exactly, Miss Marple agreed. Which suggests, does it not, that whoever wrapped this parcel had professional training in such matters, or at least regular exposure to funeral practices? Mr. Palmer turned from the window. His face was haggard, the lines around his mouth deeper than they had been that morning. I cannot see what relevance this has, he said stiffly. The important matter is that someone has sent us our daughter's lockets, someone who wishes to frighten us or mock our grief. Is it definitely your daughter's locket? Inspector Craddock asked. Beyond question, Mr. Palmer's voice was flat. Silver, with a rose engraved on the front. The initials LP inside. She wore it always. Her grandmother left it to her. And when did you last see it? The day she disappeared. She was wearing it when she left the house. He paused, then added with obvious difficulty, we never saw her again. Inspector Craddock made a note in his book. You believed she had run away with Colin Reeves, the groom from Enbury. I know she did. Mr. Palmer's voice came out harsh, defensive. The fellow had been making advances. I forbade her to see him. She defied me. His hands clenched. Young people today have no respect for parental authority. Miss Marple, who had been examining the brown paper with minute attention, looked up at this. Forgive me, she said mildly, but if your daughter ran away with this young man, how do you suppose her locket came to be posted to you a year later? Surely, if they had gone away together, she would still have it. Mr. Palmer's jaw worked. Perhaps they quarrelled. Perhaps he stole it from her. Perhaps he's sending it back now, out of spite or guilt or I don't know what. Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured. She turned her attention back to the wrapping paper. Inspector, have you noticed the paper itself? Craddock joined her at the table. Good quality, expensive. Yes, but more than that, look at the texture. And here, where it's been folded, you can see a watermark. She held it up to the light. I believe this is Cranford's wrapping paper. They're a stationer in Much Benham Reather, exclusive. You're certain? Reasonably so. My nephew Raymond sent me a birthday gift last year, wrapped in their paper. The watermark is quite distinctive. She paused. The interesting thing is that Cranford's doesn't sell to just anyone. They supply hotels, funeral homes, and better-class shops. One doesn't simply walk in off the street and buy a single sheet. Inspector Craddock made another note. I'll telephone them this afternoon. Find out who they've supplied recently in this area. And then there's the matter of the postmark, Miss Marple continued, or rather the absence of one. This wasn't sent through the post at all. It was delivered by hand directly to the doorstep, which means, Craddock said slowly, that someone came here to this house on Christmas morning. In the night, more likely, Miss Marple corrected. Mr. Palmer, what time did you discover the parcel? Just before 8. His voice was grudging. I came downstairs to stoke the fire. Saw it through the glass in the door, and it wasn't there when you retired last night. I locked up at 11. There was nothing on the step then. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So between 11 at night and 8 in the morning, someone walked up to your door and left this package on Christmas Eve night, when the village would have been quiet, when anyone moving about might have been noticed. Unless they were careful, Craddock said. Unless they knew the village well enough to move unseen. Which brings us back to Colin Reeves, Mr. Palmer said firmly. He knows every lane and alley in St. Mary Mead. Worked here for 3 years before he corrupted my daughter and took her away. Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her eyes were thoughtful. Tell me, she said, has Colin Reeves been seen in the village recently? Mr. Palmer's face darkened. I wouldn't know. I don't concern myself with the comings and goings of stable hands. But others might notice, Miss Marple persisted gently. In a village like St. Mary Mead, a young man returning after a year's absence would hardly go unremarked. Inspector Craddock looked up from his notebook with sudden interest. Are you suggesting Reeves has come back? I'm suggesting nothing, Miss Marple said. I'm merely wondering. You see, if he had come back and, if he had been noticed, it would be a simple matter to verify, Mrs. Bantry. For instance, sees everyone who passes along the main road. And young Bert at the garage knows everyone who arrives by motorbike. Craddock nodded. Mr. Palmer, what does it matter whether he's been seen? The fellow sent the locket to torment us. That much is obvious, is it? Miss Marple's voice was very quiet. I wonder, you see, if Colin Reeves had your daughter's locket, and if he wished to return it to you, why not simply post it? Why go to the trouble of expensive wrapping paper, a funeral ribbon tied in a professional knot, and deliver it in the middle of the night? To frighten you, but there are easier ways to frighten someone. If that was the intention, this seems rather elaborate, almost ritualistic. She paused, almost like a message. What sort of message? Inspector Craddock asked. Miss Marple picked up the black ribbon, letting it run through her fingers like water. I'm not entirely sure, she admitted, but I can't help thinking of something my dear mother used to say. When someone goes to great trouble over a small thing, it's usually because the small thing isn't small at all, it's everything. There was a silence. Upstairs, they could hear the faint sound of Mrs. Palmer moving about in her room despite the sedative. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. Mr. Palmer, I'll need to ask you some questions about the day your daughter disappeared. I know you've been through this before, but in light of this development, I've told you everything I know, Mr. Palmer interrupted. She left the house in the afternoon, said she was going for a walk, never came back. And you assumed she'd gone to meet Reeves. Who else? Mr. Palmer's voice was bitter. She'd been mooning about him for weeks. I told her it had to stop. She was meant for better things than a groom with no prospects. Was she a rebellious girl generally? Miss Marple asked. Mr. Palmer looked at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. Laura was beautiful, he said finally, till that young man turned her head. Miss Marple thought of several young women she had known over the years, beautiful daughters who had become suddenly rebellious. In her experience, there was always a reason, and it was not always romance. Inspector, she said, might I suggest you have the locket examined carefully, not just for identification, but for any other traces it might carry? Soil, perhaps, or other residue that might indicate where it's been kept this past year. Already arranged, Craddock said. It's being sent to the county laboratory this afternoon. Excellent, Miss Marple said, gathering up her basket. Then I shall leave you to your work. Mr. Palmer, please tell your wife I shall call tomorrow with some nourishing broth. She need her strength in the coming days. Inspector Craddock showed her to the door. On the step, he paused and lowered his voice. You think there's more to this than a vengeful lover, don't you? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that when a young woman disappears without trace, and her most treasured possession returns a year later, wrapped like a funeral offering. We would be unwise to accept the simplest explanation merely because it's the most comfortable. She walked slowly back to her cottage, her mind turning over what she had seen and heard, the expensive paper that required special suppliers, the funeral knot that spoke of professional training, the hand delivery that required intimate knowledge of the village and, most of all, Mr. Palmer's insistence that his daughter had run away with Colin Reeves, spoken with a vehemence that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. By the time she reached her gate, Miss Marple had decided that her first task must be to visit the village shop. Mrs. Clement, who ran it, knew everything about everyone in St. Mary Mead. If Colin Reeves had returned to the village, she would know, and if he had purchased expensive wrapping paper, she would certainly remember that. 2. Chapter 3. The father's denial. Boxing Day dawned cold and bright, with frost still clinging to the hedges despite the pale winter sun. Miss Marple spent the morning preparing her promised broth, adding pearl barley and a good piece of shin beef, along with the vegetables she had put by in her cellar. It was the sort of broth that built strength, both physical and moral, and Mrs. Palmer would need both in the days ahead. Her visit to the village shop the previous afternoon had been illuminating in its way. Mrs. Clement had been full of Christmas cheer and gossip in equal measure. And yes, she had indeed seen Colin Reeves some months back, September, she thought, or perhaps early October. He'd been standing in the square talking to the travelling stationer who came through once a year with his cart of fancy. Papers and writing supplies. The travelling stationer. Miss Marple had made a mental note of that. The man wouldn't return until next autumn, but there might be ways to trace him. More interesting, however, was what Mrs. Clement had not said. She had made no mention of seeing Reeves since that single sighting. In a village the size of St. Mary Mead, a young man who'd been involved in such a scandal would not simply disappear into the background unless, of course, he was deliberately keeping to the outskirts, avoiding the main thoroughfares and the shop doors where he might be recognized. Now, carrying her basket with the jar of broth wrapped carefully in a tea towel, Miss Marple made her way toward the Palmer house. She had not gone more than a few yards when she encountered Mr. Palmer himself, walking rapidly in the opposite direction with the air of a man who had somewhere urgent to be. "Mr. Palmer," she called out pleasantly. "Good morning. I was just bringing some broth for Mrs. Palmer. I do hope she's feeling somewhat recovered." He stopped, but with obvious reluctance. In the clear morning light, Miss Marple could see that he had not slept well. There were shadows under his eyes, and his collar, usually so precisely arranged, was slightly askew. "That's kind of you," he said stiffly. "My wife is still resting. Perhaps you might leave it with the daily woman." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "But if you have a moment, I wonder if I might ask you something about Laura." His face hardened immediately. "I've told Inspector Craddock everything I know. I have nothing further to add." "I'm sure you have," Miss Marple said gently. "Sometimes it helps to talk to someone who isn't official, as it were someone who simply wants to understand what happened to a young woman from the village. What happened is obvious." His voice was harsh. "She ran away with that silly stable hand, against all sense, against all proper feeling. Yes, you've said so. But I wonder if you might tell me about that last day, not the facts, which I'm sure you've related many times, but the particulars, the small details that might not have seemed important at the time." Mr. Palmer's jaw tightened. For a moment, Miss Marple thought he would simply walk away. Then, Perhaps because she was an elderly woman and harmless, or perhaps because some part of him needed to speak, he remained where he was. It was an ordinary day, he said finally. Laura came down to breakfast, ate very little, but that was not unusual. She'd been picking at her food for weeks, since you forbade her to see Reeves, since she began entertaining foolish notions about a man entirely beneath her station. He paused. She said she wanted to go for a walk to clear her head. She said, "My wife asked if she wanted company, but Laura refused. She left just after lunch, and you never saw her again." No, the word was clipped. Final dot. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, observing him with the mild interest she might have shown toward an unusual bird in her garden. It must have been very difficult, the uncertainty, not knowing if she was safe or happy, or perhaps regretful of her decision. Something flickered in Mr. Palmer's eyes, perhaps, or guilt, or some combination of the two. I have no doubt she regretted it running off with a penniless groom, who probably abandoned her the moment they reached London. But she made her choice. She chose him over her family, over everything we'd given her. And yet, Miss Marple said softly, her locket has come back. That's rather curious, don't you think? If she had truly run away to start a new life, one might expect her to keep her grandmother's locket connection to her past, to her family. Mr. Palmer's hands clenched at his sides. I don't know why that blackguard sent it back. Perhaps he stole it from her. Perhaps she gave it to him, and he's returning it now out of spite or malice. I don't pretend to understand the workings of such a man's mind. Miss Marple noticed that his right hand bore a fresh scratch fin and red running from the base of his thumb to his wrist. The sort of scratch one might get from brambles or thorns. You've hurt your hand, she observed. He glanced down, then thrust his hand into his pocket. It's nothing. I caught it on a branch yesterday while walking. How unfortunate. You must have been quite deep in thought to walk into brambles. I was thinking about this business with the locket naturally. His voice had taken on a defensive edge. It's not every day one receives such a package. No, indeed. Miss Marple paused, then said with apparent casualness, I understand the old quarry path has become quite overgrown. Terrible place for brambles this time of year. The effect of her words was immediate and striking. Mr. Palmer's face went white, then red, then white again. His eyes, which had been merely hostile, became something else entirely, trapped, perhaps, or afraid. I don't go near the quarry, he said too quickly. Haven't been there in years. Of course not, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. Why should you? Dreadful place, really. So easy to have an accident on those steep paths. Mr. Palmer took a step backward. I must go. I have business at the estate office. Naturally. Please give my regards to Mrs. Palmer. I'll leave the broth with your daily woman, as you suggested. She watched him walk away, his stride just a fraction too fast to be casual. When he reached the corner, he glanced back over his shoulder, and Miss Marple caught the expression on his face before he turned away. It was fear, pure, undiluted fear. Miss Marple continued to the Palmer house and left the broth with Mrs. Briggs, the daily woman, who reported that Mrs. Palmer was still in bed and likely to remain there for the rest of the day. Then, instead of returning home, Miss Marple turned her steps toward the village library. Miss Hartnell, the librarian, was delighted to see her. They discussed the Christmas service, which Miss Marple had missed, and the quality of the vicar's sermon, which Miss Hartnell found somewhat lacking in seasonal joy then, when the pleasantries had been properly observed. Miss Marple asked if she might consult the back numbers of the local newspaper from the previous year. "I'm trying to recall exactly when young Laura Palmer disappeared," she explained. "My memory isn't what it was, and I like to have the facts straight in my mind." Miss Hartnell was happy to oblige, producing the bound volumes from December of the previous year. Miss Marple carried them to a table by the window and began to read. The first mention of Laura's disappearance came on the 28th of December. The article was brief, stating only that Miss Laura Palmer, age 19, had left her home on the afternoon of December the 26th and not returned. Anyone with information was asked to contact the police. The subsequent editions contained more details, interviews with neighbors who had seen nothing unusual, a statement from Mr. Palmer that his daughter had been unhappy at home and had likely run away, a mention of Colin Reeves, the groom from Enbury, who had also left the village on the same day and was believed to be with Miss Palmer. But nowhere in any of the articles was there any mention of the quarry. Miss Marple sat back, thinking. If the quarry had not been part of the official investigation, why had Mr. Palmer reacted so strongly when she mentioned it? Why had he denied going there when the fresh bramble scratch on his hand suggested otherwise? She thought of his face when she'd mentioned the quarry path, that flash of fear, quickly suppressed, but unmistakable. In her long experience of human nature, Miss Marple had learned that innocent people did not react that way. Innocent people might be puzzled, or curious, or even mildly annoyed at irrelevant questions, but they did not become afraid. Mr. Palmer was hiding something connected to the quarry, and to his daughter, and to that terrible Christmas morning a year ago when Laura Palmer had walked out of her house and never returned. The question was not whether. Mr. Palmer knew more than he was saying. The question was what he knew and why he was so desperate to keep it hidden. Miss Marple returned the volumes to Miss Hartnell and walked slowly home through the winter afternoon. The sun was already sinking toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the frozen ground. She thought of the black ribbon tied in its funeral knot, the expensive wrapping paper from a supplier in Much Benham, the locket that had somehow survived a year and found its way home. And she thought of Mr. Palmer's scratched hand, and his denial, and his fear. Somewhere in all of this was the truth about Laura Palmer, and Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that the truth was very different from the story everyone had been told. Chapter 4. The paper. That wasn't sold. The village shop was doing a brisk trade in the days after Christmas, with people returning unwanted gifts or purchasing items they had run short of during the holiday. Miss Marple waited patiently while Mrs. Clement served a succession of customers, using the time to observe the stock on the shelves with the careful attention she brought to everything. The wrapping paper display was modest, brown paper in 2 grades, both serviceable but plain. A few rolls of coloured paper left over from Christmas, marked down for quick sale. Nothing that resembled the smooth, expensive paper that had wrapped the locket. When the shop finally cleared, Mrs. Clement turned to her with a smile. "Now then, Miss Marple, what can I get you today?" "More of that nice Darjeeling tea you favour," Miss Marple said. "Perhaps later. Actually, I wanted to ask you about wrapping paper, the sort one might use for a special gift." Mrs. Clement's eyes brightened with interest. "Ah, well, I'm afraid we don't carry much in that line. There's the brown paper, of course, and the Christmas paper, though that's nearly gone now. For anything fancier, people usually go into Much Benham." "I thought as much," Miss Marple said. "But I wondered about the travelling stationer you mentioned the other Dather, one who comes through once a year. Does he carry better quality paper?" "Oh yes, indeed lovely things. He has proper thick paper with watermarks, ribbon in every colour, ceiling waxed a lot. Comes every October like clockwork. Sets up his cart in the square for a week, and people buy from him. Some do. The vicar's wife usually gets her correspondence paper from him. Mrs. Bantry bought some last year for wrapping. Christmas gifts, though she complained about the price. Mrs. Clement leaned forward confidentially. Between you and me, Miss Marple, I think she just likes to be seen buying fancy things. Miss Marple smiled. Did you notice if anyone else made purchases this past October? I'm trying to recall if I bought anything myself, but my memory. Well, now, let me think. Mrs. Clement pursed her lips. Miss Hartnell bought some writing paper. Remember that. And young Dr. Haydock got wrapping paper for his mother's birthday. As for others, I couldn't say for certain. The stationer doesn't set up right outside my window. You understand, just across the square. But you did mention seeing Colin Reeves speaking with him. Mrs. Clement's expression grew cautious. I did see them talking, yes. Whether he bought anything, I couldn't say. They were just standing by the cart having a conversation. Do you remember what they were discussing? I was too far away to hear, but I remember thinking it was odd seeing young Reeves in the village at all. After what happened with the Palmer girl, I'd have thought he'd stay well away. Yet he came back, Miss Marple observed. That suggests a certain boldness, wouldn't you say, or perhaps necessity? Mrs. Clement nodded slowly. I've wondered about that myself. If he ran off with Laura Palmer, why come back at all? And if he didn't run off with her, where's he been this past year? It was, Miss Marple reflected, an excellent question. This travelling stationer, she said. Do you know his name, or where he might be found between his visits to St. Mary Mead? He's called Parsons, I believe, or Pearson, something like that. As to where he goes, I couldn't tell you. He makes a circuit of the villages, I expect. Probably has a route that takes him around the county. Miss Marple thanked her and purchased Darjeeling tea after all, along with a tin of biscuits that she didn't particularly need, but felt obliged to by after taking up so much of Mrs. Clement's time. Outside, she paused in the square where the stationer would have set up his cart. It was a good location, visible from several directions. Anyone making a purchase would likely have been seen by at least a few people, unless, of course, they had waited until after dark or arranged to meet the stationer. Elsewhere, she was considering this possibility, when she noticed something that made her stop and look more carefully, just beyond the square, near the wall of the old coaching inn. There was a shop she had quite forgotten about, small, tucked away, easily missed if one wasn't looking for it. Grimby's Funeral Supplies. Mr. Grimby had been providing burial services to St. Mary Mead and the surrounding villages for 30 years. His shop supplied everything necessary for a proper funeral, from coffin handles to memorial cards, and Miss Marple suddenly remembered mourning ribbons. She crossed the square with renewed purpose and pushed open the door. A small bell chimed, announcing her arrival. Mr. Grimby emerged from the back room, a small, neat man with thinning hair and the carefully neutral expression of one accustomed to dealing with grief. Miss Marple, he said, his voice suitably subdued. How may I help you today? I hope there hasn't been a bereavement. Thankfully, no, Miss Marple assured him. I wanted to ask you about mourning ribbons, black silk ribbons, specifically. Mr. Grimby's professional demeanour didn't waver. Of course, we stock several grades for wreaths, memorial cards, or personal use. I'm interested in how they're tied. I noticed recently that funeral ribbons are tied in a very particular way, different from an ordinary bow. Ah, yes. Mr. Grimby nodded. The burial knot. It's a traditional method used to ensure the ribbon doesn't come loose. Very secure, very dignified. All properly trained funeral directors know how to tie it, I see. And is it taught only to funeral directors, or might someone else learn it? Mr. Grimby considered this. Well, anyone who worked in the trade would pick it up, eventually funeral home staff, coffin makers, even those who prepare the deceased for burial. It's not a secret, exactly, but it's not common knowledge either. Would you say it's distinctive enough that someone familiar with funerals would recognize it? Without question, Mr. Grimby said firmly. Once you've seen it properly tied, you don't forget it. It has a certain finality about it. Miss Marple thanked him and turned to leave, then paused as if struck by a sudden thought. Mr. Grimby, do you happen to know of any funeral homes in the northern part of the county near Much Benham, perhaps? Several, he replied. There's Morton and Sons in Much Benham itself, Henderson's in Little Marsham, and Blackwell's in Kingsbridge, all reputable establishments. Thank you. You've been most helpful. She walked home slowly, her mind working through what she had learned. The wrapping paper came from a supplier in Much Benham. The ribbon was tied with a funeral director's knot, and Colin Reeves had been seen talking to the travelling stationer, who sold expensive wrapping paper, but the pieces didn't quite fit together yet. If Reeves had wanted to send the locket to the Palmers, why use funeral wrapping? Why go to such elaborate lengths? Unless, of course, the message wasn't from Reeves at all. Miss Marple let herself into her cottage and put the kettle on for tea. While it boiled, she retrieved a small notebook from her desk and began to make notes. She had learned over the years that writing things down often revealed patterns that remained hidden in one's mind. The travelling stationer had been in the village in October. Colin Reeves had been seen talking to him, but that was months before the locket arrived on Christmas morning. If Reeves had purchased wrapping paper, then where had he kept it? Where had he been living all these months? And more importantly, where had he kept the locket itself? She thought of the black ribbon with its perfect funeral knot. Mr. Grimby had said it was tied by someone with training or regular exposure to funeral practices. Colin Reeves had worked at Enbury Estate as a groomman, less he had secretly trained as an undertaker. He would not know how to tie such a knot, which meant either someone had tied it for him more. He wasn't the one who had sent the package at all. Miss Marple poured her tea and sat by the window, looking out at the gathering dusk. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead or its environs, there was someone who knew how to tie a funeral knot, who had access to expensive wrapping paper, and who possessed Laura Palmer's locket. Someone who wanted the Palmer family to receive that locket on Christmas morning, wrapped like a burial offering. Someone who wanted them to remember, or to know, or perhaps to fear. The question was, why? And the answer, Miss Marple was increasingly certain, lay not in London, where Laura Palmer was supposed to have run away to, but somewhere much closer to home. Somewhere, perhaps, near an overgrown quarry path where brambles grew thick and Mr. Palmer's hand had been freshly scratched. Chapter 5. Lunch at Gable's cottage. 2 days after her conversation with Mr. Grimby, Miss Marple extended an invitation to Mrs. Palmer for lunch. She did so through the Daily Woman, Mrs. Briggs, who reported that Mrs. Palmer had finally come downstairs and was sitting in the drawing-room, staring at nothing in particular. Like a ghost, she is, Mrs. Briggs confided. Hardly touches her food, just sits and stares. Mr. Palmer's no better, snaps at everyone, then shuts himself in his study for hours on end. Miss Marple had expected resistance to her invitation, but to her mild surprise, Mrs. Palmer accepted. Perhaps, Miss Marple thought, the poor woman was desperate for any change from the oppressive atmosphere of her own home. Mrs. Palmer arrived at Gable's cottage at 12, looking pale and drawn, but neatly dressed in a grey wool suit that matched her mood. Miss Marple greeted her warmly and settled her in the sitting room with a small glass of cherry brandy before lunch. "So kind of you to invite me," Mrs. Palmer said quietly. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the glass. "I'm afraid I'm not very good company at present." "Nonsense," Miss Marple said gently. "After what you've been through, it's a wonder you're managing it all. These past few days must have been dreadful." Mrs. Palmer's eyes filled with tears. "You can't imagine seeing Laura's locket again after all this time. It brought everything back so vividly the day she left, the searching, the waiting for word that never came." "It must have been a terrible shock," Miss Marple agreed. She paused, then added casually, "Though I suppose in one way it might have brought a certain relief to know that she kept it, that she valued it even after she left." Mrs. Palmer looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Well," Miss Marple said, "if Laura had truly wanted to sever connection with her family, one might expect her to have sold the locket or discarded it. The fact that someone has it now suggests she kept it with her a connection to home, perhaps to you." A tear spilled down Mrs. Palmer's cheek. "I've tried to tell myself that wherever she is, she thinks of us sometimes, that she didn't leave because she hated us." "I am quite sure she didn't hate you," Miss Marple said. "Young people sometimes make foolish choices, but that doesn't mean they stop loving their parents." She rose and moved toward the kitchen. "Let me just check on the lunch. I've made a chicken pie. I do hope you'll manage to eat something." The lunch was simple but well prepared. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the best way to encourage confidences was to create an atmosphere of comfort and normality. People talked more freely over good food in a warm room than they ever did in formal interrogations. For the first few minutes, they spoke of inconsequential things, the weather, the post-Christmas sales at the shops in Much Benham, the vicar's plans for the New Year service. Mrs. Palmer picked at her food, but managed to eat more than Miss Marple had expected. Then, when the main course was finished and Miss Marple was serving apple tart with cream, she said quietly, "Mrs. Palmer, may I ask you something rather personal about Laura?" Mrs. Palmer stiffened slightly, but nodded. "Did she seem happy in the weeks before she disappeared?" Cited, perhaps, about the prospect of running away with Colin Reeves. Mrs. Palmer's hands clenched around her napkin. She seemed troubled. "I thought it was because her father had forbidden her to see Reeves. But now I wonder if there was something else." "What makes you wonder that?" There was a long pause. Mrs. Palmer stared down at her plate, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There was a letter." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but every sense was suddenly alert. "A letter. It came a week before she disappeared. I found it in her room after she left. I didn't show it to anyone, not even my husband. I was afraid." "Afraid of what, my dear?" Mrs. Palmer looked up, and her eyes were full of pain and guilt. "Afraid of what it might mean. Afraid of the scandal." "Oh, Miss Marple, you've been such a coward." Miss Marple reached across the table and took her hand. "Why don't you tell me about it? Sometimes it helps to share a burden." Mrs. Palmer drew a shuddering breath. The letter was in Laura's own hand. She wrote it to Mead, never posted it. I think she was trying to explain to prepare me for something. She said she had discovered something terribly wrong, something at the stables at Enbury Estate. Yes. She didn't give details, but she said she had to meet someone secretly. Someone who could help her understand what she'd found. She wrote that she was frightened, but that she had to do what was right. Miss Marple's mind was racing. And you think this meeting was connected to her disappearance? I don't know what to think, Mrs. Palmer said miserably. My husband manages the estate finances UC has done for years. If there was something wrong at the stables, some irregularity might reflect badly on him. I was afraid that if I showed the letter to the police, they would investigate my husband, that there would be questions, accusations, so you hid it. Yes, the word came out as a sob. I told myself it didn't matter that Laura had run away with Reeves, and the letter was just girlish dramatics. But I never believed it. Not really. And now the locket has come back, and I can't stop thinking about what was in that letter. Miss Marple poured them both more tea, giving Mrs. Palmer time to compose herself. Do you still have the letter? She asked gently. Mrs. Palmer nodded. I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. It's the last thing she wrote. I keep it hidden in my writing desk. Would you show it to me? Mrs. Palmer hesitated, then nodded again. Would you come back with me now? My husband has gone to the estate office. He won't be home until evening. They walked back to the Palmer house through the cold afternoon, Mrs. Palmer clinging to Miss Marple's arm as if for support. Inside, the house was silent and felt abandoned though. Mrs. Briggs could be heard moving about in the kitchen. Mrs. Palmer led Miss Marple upstairs to a small sitting room that was evidently her private domain. The writing desk stood by the window, a delicate piece of furniture that looked as though it had been in the family for generations. She unlocked a drawer and withdrew an envelope. Her hands shook as she handed it to Miss Marple. The letter was written on cream-coloured paper in a young woman's flowing hand. Miss Marple read it carefully twice, committing the important passages to memory. Dearest Mother, I am writing this because I may need your help, and I want you to understand why. I have discovered something at the stables that troubles me greatly. Money has been going missing from the accounts, and I believe I know who's responsible. It isn't Colin, as Father suspects. It's someone else, entirely someone Father trusts. Greater than. I've arranged to meet this person tomorrow to confront them privately, to give them a chance to explain or make restitution. Colin has offered to come with me, but I said no. This is something I must do myself. Greater than if anything should happen, if I should not return. Please know that I acted out of conscience and duty. And please, Mother, do not let Father blame Colin. He has been nothing but kind and honest. Greater than your loving daughter, Laura. Miss Marple looked up. She never sent this. No, I found it in her room in Sildaz, if she'd meant to give it to me, but lost her nerve. Or perhaps she ran out of time, and you're certain your husband hasn't seen it. Absolutely certain. He would have demanded to know what Laura meant about money going missing. He would have investigated every account, questioned everyone at the estate. Mrs. Palmer's voice broke. He would have been furious that she'd kept such information from him. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. Mrs. Palmer, I think you should show this to Inspector Craddock. But my husband, your husband, Miss Marple said gently but firmly, is not the one you need to protect right now. Laura wrote that someone at the estate was embezzling funds, someone your husband trusted. That person may well be connected to her disappearance. Mrs. Palmer sank into a chair. I've been so afraid of scandal, afraid of what people would think, afraid of hurting my husband. But Laura deserves better than my cowardice, doesn't she?" "She does," Miss Marple agreed. "And I suspect that whoever sent that locket to you on Christmas morning intended to force exactly this reckoning. They wanted the past reopened as Mead understood. Who would do such a thing?" "Someone who knows the truth," Miss Marple said, "or who knows enough of it to want the rest revealed." She helped Mrs. Palmer downstairs and waited while the woman composed herself. Before she left, she said quietly, "I would speak to Inspector Craddock today if I were you, for your husband returns armed. I would tell him everything." Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple's mind was busy arranging the new information into the pattern that was slowly emerging. Laura Palmer had discovered embezzlement at the stables. She had planned to confront the guilty party. She had disappeared after writing a letter she never sent, leaving behind only a locket and a trail of unanswered questions. And now, a year later, someone had wrapped that locket in expensive paper and tied it with a funeral ribbon, delivering it to her parents on Christmas morning as if it were a burial offering. The message was becoming clearer. This was not a prank or a cruel joke. This was an accusation, a testimony from beyond the grave. The question was no longer whether Laura Palmer had run away with Colin Reeves. The question was who had killed her and why they had felt safe enough to keep her locket for a year before sending it home, wrapped in black ribbon like a final gift from the dead. Chapter 6. The Girl in the Photograph. Inspector Craddock called on Miss Marple the following morning, looking both gratified and troubled in equal measure. Double quotes. "Mrs. Palmer came to see me yesterday evening," he said, accepting the cup of tea she offered. "She showed me her daughter's letter. I wish she'd come forward with it a year ago." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But fear and shame are powerful forces. Inspector, Mrs. Palmer was trying to protect her husband's reputation, perhaps, in some way, her own peace of mind. It's easier to believe one's daughter ran away than to face the alternative being murder." "Quite so." Craddock stirred his tea thoughtfully. "The letter changes everything. If Laura Palmer discovered embezzlement at the estate, and if she confronted the person responsible, that gives us a clear motive for harm." "It does, indeed. Have you spoken to Mr. Palmer about the estate accounts?" "I have. He was shocked, as you might imagine. Insists that all financial matters are handled properly, that there's never been any irregularity, but he's agreed to a full audit of the books going back 2 years. That's something, at least," Miss Marple said, "though I suspect the irregularities, if they existed, have been carefully concealed by now. You think the embezzler has had time to cover their tracks? A year is quite sufficient time for someone clever to rearrange accounts and destroy evidence, particularly if they believed Laura Palmer was safely gone and would never return to tell what she knew." Craddock set down his cup. "There's something else, something that came up. During my conversation with Mr. Palmer, he mentioned that the estate's former accountant, a man named Arthur Briggs, left rather suddenly about 18 months ago, just before Laura began working part-time at the stables." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. "Left suddenly or was dismissed?" "A bit of both, apparently. There were questions about his bookkeeping. Nothing proven, but enough doubt that Mr. Palmer suggested he might be happier elsewhere. Briggs left without giving proper notice, and they never heard from him again." "How very convenient," Miss Marple murmured, "for him to disappear just when questions were being asked. Mr. Palmer assumed Briggs had gone to London to find work but now I'm wondering if he stayed closer than anyone thought. As am I, Miss Marple said. She paused, then added, Inspector, I wonder if you would object to my visiting the stables at Enbury Estate, purely as a matter of curiosity, you understand. I've always been interested in horses. Craddock smiled slightly. I wouldn't dream of objecting, Miss Marple. In fact, I'd be grateful if you'd let me know anything you observe. You have a way of noticing things that others miss. After the inspector departed, Miss Marple put on her warmest coat and set out for Enbury Estate. It was a walk of perhaps a mile along a lane bordered by bare hedges and frozen fields. The estate itself was handsomer Georgian manor house, set in extensive grounds, with the stables situated some distance from the main house. The stable yard was quiet when she arrived. A few horses looked out from their boxes, their breaths steaming in the cold air. A young groom was mucking out one of the stalls, and he looked up in surprise when Miss Marple appeared. "Help you, ma'am?" he asked, touching his cap. "I do hope so," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I was hoping to speak with whoever manages the stables these days." "I'm Miss Marple from the village." "That would be Mr. Thornton, ma'am. He's in the office just through there." Miss Marple thanked him and made her way to the small office at the end of the stable block. The door stood ajar, and she could see a man of about 40 sitting at a desk, working through a ledger. He looked up when she knocked. "Mr. Thornton, forgive the intrusion. I'm Miss Marple from St. Mary Mead." Thornton rose, a tall man with the weathered face of someone who spent his days outdoors. "Come in, Miss Marple, though I'm afraid if you're here about boarding a horse, we're quite full at present." "Oh, nothing like that," Miss Marple assured him. "Actually, I was hoping you might indulge an old woman's curiosity. I knew Laura Palmer slightly, and I've been thinking about her a great deal since that dreadful business with the locket. I understand she used to help out here." Thornton's expression grew somber. "She did. Sweet girl, always good with the horses. It was a terrible thing, her running off like that. Though, between you and me, I never quite believed she went willingly. She loved those horses, and she was conscientious about her work. Never missed a day unless she was truly ill, not the sort to abandon her responsibilities on a whim." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "I wonder, Mr. Thornton, did Laura ever mention anything unusual to you? Any concerns about the stable operations?" Thornton hesitated, clearly weighing his words. "She did ask some odd questions toward the end about feed suppliers and invoices. I told her such matters were handled by the estate office, that she needn't worry herself about them, but she continued to worry, seemed to. Yes, she'd go quiet sometimes, like she was thinking hard about something. And once I found her in here, after hours, looking through old invoices. Said she was just curious about how a stable was run, that she might want to work with horses professionally someday." Miss Marple looked around the small office. It was neat and organized, with ledgers stacked on shelves and a calendar pinned to the wall. And there, beside the calendar, was a corkboard with various notices and reminders, a photograph. "May I?" Miss Marple asked, moving closer to examine it. The photograph showed a young woman standing beside a dark-haired young man in working clothes. They were both smiling, and the young woman's hand rested on the neck of her chestnut mare. Even in the faded print, Miss Marple could see that the woman was pretty, with fair hair and a bright, intelligent face. "That's Laura," Thornton said quietly. "Taken about 6 months before she disappeared. And the young man, that was before my time, but I believe that's Arthur Briggs. Used to handle the estate accounts. Left before I arrived." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. not Colin Reeves. No, ma'am. Reeves is the dark fellow in the photograph over there. He pointed to another picture showing a group of stable hands. Never had much to do with Laura, as far as I know. That story about them running off together never made sense to me. Miss Marple studied the photograph of Laura and Briggs more carefully. They stood close together, but there was nothing romantic in their posture. They looked more like colleagues sharing a moment of satisfaction, perhaps after successfully treating the horse. Mr. Thornton, would you mind terribly if I borrowed this photograph just for a day or two? I promise to return it safely. Thornton looked uncertain. Well, I suppose there's no harm in it. It's been hanging there for over a year now. No one's asked for it before. Miss Marple carefully unpinned the photograph and slipped it into her handbag. You've been most helpful. One last question, if I may. Do you know what became of Arthur Briggs after he left the estate? Haven't the faintest idea, ma'am. He was gone before I took the position. Mr. Palmer might know, but he doesn't care to speak about Briggs. From what I gather, there was some unpleasantness about the accounts. Miss Marple thanked him again and made her way back through the stable yard. As she passed the young groom, a thought struck her. "Excuse me," she called. "You've been working here a while, haven't you?" 3 years come spring, ma'am. Then you must have known Colin Reeves. The young man's face darkened. Knew him, I did. Good fella, Colin was got a raw deal, if you ask me. Oh, everyone said he ran off with Miss Laurabette. I never believed it. Colin was soft on her, true enough, but he knew she was above his station. He'd never have pressed his suit hand, she'd never have encouraged him. They were friends, nothing more. Do you know where Colin is now? The groom glanced around nervously, as if checking they were alone. Can't say for certain, ma'am, but I did see him a few months back, skulking around the edge of the village. Looked like he'd been sleeping rough. When he saw me, he took off running. Did you tell anyone? No, ma'am. Figured if Colin wanted to be seen, he'd show himself proper. If he was hiding, he had his reasons. Miss Marple walked slowly home, her mind busy with this new information. The photograph in her handbag seemed to burn with significance. Laura Palmer and Arthur Briggs standing together beside a horse. Both of them smiling as if they shared a secret. What if the secret was the embezzlement Laura had discovered? What if Briggs hadn't simply left when questions arose about his bookkeeping, but had stayed nearby, watching and waiting? What if Laura had arranged to meet Briggs, thinking she could persuade him to make things right, never imagining that he might choose a more permanent solution to the problem she represented? And what if Colin Reeves, who everyone assumed had run away with, Laura had actually been trying to protect her from something? Someone. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple laid the photograph on her desk and studied it under the lamp. There was something about Briggs's face that troubled her not in the photograph itself, where he looked pleasant and ordinary, but in what the photograph represented, a man who had access to the estate finances, a man who had left under suspicious circumstances, a man who had been photographed with Laura Palmer just months before she disappeared, a man who knew how to tie accounts up neatly to make irregularities disappear, to cover his tracks, and perhaps, Miss Marple thought grimly, a man who knew how to make a young woman disappear as well. The question now was whether Arthur Briggs had truly left the area, whether he had simply reinvented himself, taking on a new identity while remaining close enough to monitor the situation. Close enough, perhaps, to work in a funeral home where he might learn to tie a black ribbon in a perfect undertaker's, not Chapter 7, footprints, toward the quarry. The following morning brought a hard frost that turned the landscape into something resembling a Christmas card. Miss Marple stood at her window, observing the crystalline beauty of the frozen garden, and thought how deceptive appearances could be. Everything looked pristine and peaceful, yet beneath the surface, dark truths were waiting to be uncovered. She had spent much of the previous evening examining the photograph from the stables, and this morning she had a plan. Inspector Craddock had mentioned the quarry path where Laura was last seen, and Mr. Palmer's inexplicable fear when she had mentioned it. If there were answers to be found, they might well be near that abandoned quarry. After breakfast, Miss Marple dressed warmly and set out. She told her daily help, Lucy, that she was taking a constitutional walk for her health. Lucy looked dubious, but knew better than to argue with Miss Marple once her mind was made up. The path to the old quarry led through a wooded area at the edge of the estate. It had once been used for cutting stone, but the quarry had been abandoned for 20 years or more, deemed too dangerous after a fatal accident. Now it was a place children were warned away from, though Miss Marple suspected that prohibition only increased its attraction to the more adventurous young people. The path was narrow and overgrown, exactly as she had imagined. Brambles reached across it from both sides, their thorns catching at her coat. She thought of the scratch on Mr. Palmer's hand, nodded to herself. This was exactly the sort of place where one might acquire such an injury. The frost had done her an unexpected service, where the ground was muddy and exposed. The frozen surface had preserved footprints with remarkable clarity. Miss Marple stopped and examined them carefully. 2 sets of prints, both relatively fresh, perhaps made within the last few days. One set was large, made by a man's boot with a distinctive tread pattern. The other was lighter, smaller, but still too large to be a woman's. Both sets led toward the quarry. Miss Marple followed them carefully, moving slowly to avoid disturbing any evidence. The constabulary would need to see this. As she rounded a bend in the path, she caught sight of movement ahead. A young man in a dark coat was standing near the quarry's edge, looking down into the depths. For a moment, Miss Marple thought it might be Mr. Palmer returned to the side, but this man was younger, slimmer. He must have heard her approach, for he turned sharply. His face showed shock, then fear, and then he was running, crashing through the undergrowth with the desperation of a hunted animal. "Wait!" Miss Marple called, but he was already gone, disappearing into the trees like a shadow. She stood very still, listening to the sound of his flight fading into the distance. Then she turned her attention to where he had been standing. The quarry edge was closer than she had realized, and she took care to keep well back from it. The drop was steep, perhaps 30 feet to the rocky bottom, where water had collected in dark, cold pools. A dangerous place indeed, but it was what lay near the edge that caught her attention. Between 2 stones, wedged in so tightly that it had survived wind and weather, was a scrap of black ribbon. Miss Marple knelt carefully and examined it without touching it. The ribbon was silk, she was certain, and it had been torn, not cut. One end showed the distinctive loop of the funeral knot she had seen on the Christmas parcel. Someone had been here, someone who had carried or worn that black ribbon, and who had either left it deliberately as a marker or lost it accidentally. She rose and looked around more carefully. The 2 sets of footprints she had followed converged here near the quarry's edge. They circled the area as if the people who had made them had been searching for something or discussing something while walking back and forth. The larger footprints, Miss Marple noted, matched the size and tread pattern of a gentleman's boot, Mr. Palmer's. She would wager a considerable sum, but the smaller prints were more difficult to identify. Not quite large enough for a tall man, but too large for most women unless, of course. The woman in question wore men's boots for warmth and practicality. Miss Marple was considering this possibility when she heard voices approaching. She turned to see Constable Polka making his way along the path, followed by a younger officer she didn't recognize, Miss Marple. Polka called out, his tone mixing relief with exasperation. "We've been looking for you. Your Lucy said you'd gone for a walk, and when Haydock mentioned seeing you heading this way, well, we thought we'd better check." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple said, "though I assure you, I'm quite capable of taking a walk without getting lost." "It's not getting lost we're worried about, ma'am," Polka said. "This quarry is a dangerous place, and with everything that's been happening, well, we'd prefer if you stayed clear of it." "I quite understand," Miss Marple said, "but I'm very glad you're here, Constable. There are several things I think Inspector Craddock should see." She showed them the footprints, pointing out the two distinct sets and their peculiar circling pattern near the quarry's edge. Then she directed their attention to the scrap of ribbon. Polka whistled softly. "That's from the parcel, isn't it? Same black ribbon." "I believe so," Miss Marple said. "Though of course Inspector Craddock will need to confirm it, but I think you'll find it matches exactly." The younger constable was already making notes. Polka knelt to examine the prints more closely. "These large ones here, they look like they might match Mr. Palmer's boots. The inspector had us check his footwear yesterday after Mrs. Palmer came forward with that letter. And do they match? Can't say for certain without bringing him down here for a proper comparison, but they're similar. Same size, similar tread." Miss Marple nodded. "Mr. Palmer told me he came to the quarry recently. He seemed quite defensive about it, but perhaps he was simply being truthful." "And the other set?" Polka asked, indicating the smaller prints. "Those I cannot account for," Miss Marple admitted, "though I did see a young man here just before you arrived. He ran off when he saw me." "A young man? Can you describe him?" "Dark coat, perhaps, in his mid—" "I only saw him briefly, but I had the impression he was frightened rather than threatening." Polka and the young constable exchanged glances. "Could have been Colin Reeves. He's been spotted around the village a few times in recent months, though he keeps well hidden. Fits your description." "If it was Mr. Reeves," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "one wonders what brought him to the quarry and whether he's been here before." She moved carefully around the area, her sharp eyes scanning the frozen ground. A few yards back from the edge, partially hidden by a fallen log, she spotted something else. "Constable," she called, "I think you should see this." It was a piece of fabric wool, by the look of it snagged on a low branch. The fabric was dark grey, good quality, and it had been torn from something a coat. Perhaps Polka examined it carefully. "Fresh," he said. "I've not been here long, or the weather would have faded it." "I noticed," Miss Marple said, "that Mr. Palmer was wearing a grey wool coat when I spoke with him 2 days ago. Of course, grey wool coats are hardly uncommon." "No, but combined with the footprints and that scratch on his hand—" Polka left the sentence unfinished. Miss Marple looked back toward the quarry's edge. "Mr. Palmer claimed he received an anonymous note telling him to look where you left her. Those were his words, were they not?" "According to what he told the inspector, yes. Then perhaps he came here looking for something. Or perhaps he came here because he already knew what he would find." "You think he knows what happened to his daughter?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Mr. Palmer knows more than he has admitted. Whether that knowledge extends to his daughter's fate, I cannot say, but his behavior suggests guilt of some kind, whether it be the guilt of action or the guilt of silence. The younger constable had been following the footprints further along the path. Now he called out, "Sir, there's more prints over here leading away from the quarry back toward the village. Same 2 sets. Polka went to look end. Miss Marple followed more slowly. The prints were indeed the same, one large and one smaller, both heading away from the quarry in the direction of St. Mary Mead. They walked here together," Polka said. "Or at least they were both here at the same time, within a day or 2 of each other." "The question is why," Miss Marple said. "What brought them both to this spot? What were they looking for?" She thought of the torn ribbon, the piece of grey wool, the circling footprints near the edge. Someone had been searching for something here, and someone else, perhaps, had been watching them search. "I think," she said slowly, "that we should speak with Mr. Palmer again, and this time we should ask him directly about the anonymous note, who sent it, what exactly it said, and why it brought him to the quarry." "The inspector will want to do that himself," Polka said. "Of course, but there's something else that occurs to me, Constable. If Mr. Palmer received a note telling him to look where you left her, the writer of that note knew something. Something about Laura Palmer's disappearance, something about this quarry. You think the note came from Colin Reeves?" Miss Marple considered the young man she had glimpsed standing at the quarry's edge with such a look of desperation on his face. "I think," she said, "that Colin Reeves may know a great deal about what happened to Laura Palmer, but I don't believe he's the villain of this piece. I believe he's frightened and hiding and, perhaps trying, in his own way, to bring the truth to light. Then who?" "That," Miss Marple said, "is what we must discover. But I suspect the answer lies not in London, where everyone assumed Laura had gone, but somewhere much closer. Somewhere within reach of this quarry, where a young woman's locket was kept for a year, before being sent home wrapped in a funeral ribbon." She looked once more at the dark water far below and thought of secrets buried deep, and of the patient, inexorable way in which truth always found its way to the surface. Chapter 8. The Ribbed Cotton Spectre. Craddock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage that afternoon with news that deepened the mystery considerably. "The fabric you found at the quarry," he said, accepting a cup of tea with the air of a man who needed fortification. "It matches Mr. Palmer's coat. He admitted as much when I showed it to him this morning." "Did he indeed?" Miss Marple said. "And what explanation did he offer?" "He said he went to the quarry 3 days ago after receiving an anonymous note. The note was brief, just a single line, 'Look where you left her.' It was unsigned, pushed under his door in the middle of the night." "How very dramatic," Miss Marple observed. "And he went alone." "So he claims. Says he had to know what the note meant, that he couldn't rest until he checked the quarry. He caught his coat on a branch and tore it while searching the area." "Searching for what, precisely?" Craddock set down his cup. "That's what I asked him. He became evasive, said he wasn't sure, that he was simply looking." But Miss Marple, the man, was terrified. Not angry, not defensive, but genuinely frightened. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Fear is a powerful motivator, Inspector. It can drive people to do extraordinary things, or to conceal extraordinary truths. You think he knows what happened to his daughter? I think he fears he knows. There's a difference." She paused, considering her words carefully. "Mr. Palmer has been insisting for a year that Laura ran away with Colin Reeves. He's repeated it so often that one might almost believe he's trying to convince himself. But his reaction to the locket, his visit to the quarry, his fear when I mentioned the place, suggests that he's been living. With a dreadful suspicion he's been unable or unwilling to voice a suspicion that his daughter didn't run away at all precisely. Craddock stood and walked to the window, looking out at the frozen garden. We've been making inquiries about Arthur Briggs, the former accountant. It's been difficult to trace him. No record of employment under that name anywhere in the county. No forwarding address, no references requested from subsequent employers. As if he disappeared. Or changed his name, Craddock said, turning back to face her. I've sent inquiries to funeral homes in the northern part of the county. If Briggs took work in that trade-ass, your theory about the ribbon suggests someone might remember him, though possibly not under the name Briggs. No, but a man's appearance is harder to change than his name. I've asked Mr. Palmer to provide a description, and I've requested the photograph you obtained from the stables. Miss Marple rose and retrieved the photograph from her desk. I was going to bring it to you this afternoon. You'll see that Laura and Briggs appear quite friendly in the picture, not romantically involved, I think, but comfortable with one another. Craddock studied the photograph with interest. Briggs looks ordinary enough, medium height, dark hair, no distinguishing features, the sort of man who could blend into a crowd. Or into a new identity, Miss Marple suggested. If one wished to remain in the area without being recognized, working in a funeral home would be quite clever. People avoid such establishments unless necessity compels them. One could live a quiet life keeping to oneself, drawing little attention, and learning to tie funeral knots, Craddock added grimly. They were interrupted by a knock at the door. Miss Marple's daily help showed in a boy of perhaps 12, red-faced from running and clutching something in his hand. Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, the boy gasped. I'm Tommy Diggs. My mum said I should bring this to you straight away. Found it this morning near the quarry court, on the fence by the upper path. He held out a piece of fabric, then the scrap that had been found earlier. This was clearly from a coat lining in grey wool with a distinctive herringbone pattern. I heard Constable Polker telling my dad about finding bits of cloth up there, Tommy continued. So I thought this might be important. Very important indeed, Miss Marple said warmly. Thank you, Tommy. That was most observant of you. She gave the boy 6pence for his trouble, and he departed, looking pleased with himself. Craddock examined the new piece of fabric closely. This is more than just a snag on a branch, he said. This has been torn violently, as if someone caught their coat on the fence and pulled hard to free themselves, or as if there was a struggle. Miss Marple looked at the fabric thoughtfully. The fence by the upper path, you said, Tommy. That's not the main approach to the quarry. No, Craddock agreed. The upper path comes in from the east, from the direction of the estate. It's overgrown and rarely used now, but someone used it recently enough to tear their coat on the fence. Someone wearing a grey wool coat with a herringbone lining. Mr. Palmer's coat, Craddock said, or a coat very like it. The inspector gathered up both pieces of fabric. I'm going to confront Palmer with this. The man needs to tell us the truth about what happened at that quarry, and he needs to tell us now. After Craddock departed, Miss Marple sat quietly, letting her mind work through the accumulated evidence. The anonymous note, the torn coat, the footprints circling near the quarry's edge, the scrap of black ribbon lodged between stones, and the young man she had seen at the quarry who had run away rather than face questions. She was still considering these elements when there came another knock at her door. This time it was Mrs. Palmer, looking even more distressed than she had at their lunch. Miss Marple, forgive me for calling unannounced, but I didn't know where else to turn. The police have taken my husband away for questioning. They've found something at the quarry, something to do with his coat, and they think—" Her voice broke. "Come in, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, guiding her to a chair. "Tell me exactly what happened." Mrs. Palmer's story tumbled out in fragments. The inspector had arrived with pieces of torn fabric. Her husband had gone white when he saw them. He'd admitted that yes, his coat had been torn at the quarry, but he'd said nothing about the upper path or the fence. The inspector had asked him repeatedly what he had been doing there, what he'd been looking for, and finally her husband had broken down, he told them. Mrs. Palmer whispered that he received the anonymous note, and it filled him with such dread that he had to go to the quarry. He said the note made him think that perhaps Laura hadn't run away at all, that perhaps something terrible had happened to her there. And had he suspected this before the note arrived? Mrs. Palmer's hands twisted in her lap. He said he'd tried not to think about it, that he had convinced himself she was alive somewhere, starting a new life, but deep down he'd always feared the worst. The quarry was where she'd been going when she left the house that day. She'd told me she was taking a walk, but my husband had seen her from his study window heading in that direction. Did he follow her? No, he assumed she was meeting Colin Reeves. He was angry but decided to let her go, thinking she'd come home once she'd cooled down and seen sense. But she never came home. And when Colin disappeared, too, my husband convinced himself they'd run away together. It was easier than believing she might have met with harm. Miss Marple finished gently. Yes, but when the locket arrived, wrapped like a burial offering, he couldn't deny it any longer. He had to know. So he went to the quarry and searched. He said he found nothing, but the place filled him with such horror that he could barely make himself look. And the torn coat. He said he panicked when he heard someone coming. He thought it might be whoever had sent the note, someone who meant him harm. He ran toward the upper path and caught his coat on the fence. He pulled free on, didn't stop running until he was safely home. Miss Marple considered this account carefully. It had the ring of truth to it, the kind of messy, illogical truth that real life produced. A calculated lie would have been neater. Double quotes, Mrs. Palmer, she said. Did your husband see who was at the quarry? Did he see the person he was running from? He said he didn't wait to find out. He just ran, I see. Miss Marple paused. There's something I must tell you. I was at the quarry this morning, and I saw a young man there. He ran away when he saw Mead, just as your husband ran when he heard someone approaching. I believe the young man may have been Colin Reeves. Colin? Mrs. Palmer looked up sharply. But why would he be at the quarry? That, Miss Marple said, is what we must discover. But I'm beginning to think that Colin Reeves may hold the key to this entire mystery, not as the villain, but as a witness. Perhaps even as the person who sent that anonymous note to your husband. But why? Why would Colin send such a note? Miss Marple thought of the young man's frightened face, his desperate flight through the woods. Because, she said slowly, he wants the truth to come out, but he's afraid. Afraid of what happened, or afraid of who was responsible, or perhaps afraid that no one will believe him. So he sends anonymous notes and leaves mysterious parcels, hoping to force an investigation without having to reveal himself. You think Colin knows what happened to Laura? I think Colin knows something, and I think we must find him before anyone else does. Chapter 9. The Man Who Came Back. The search for Colin Reeves began in earnest the following morning. Inspector Craddock organized a systematic effort. with constables checking the old shepherds' huts and abandoned buildings scattered across the countryside around St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, meanwhile, pursued her own inquiries in a quieter fashion. She began with the young groom at Enbury Estate, the one who had admitted seeing Reeves skulking around the village months earlier. Young Tom Barlow was mucking out stalls when she arrived, and he looked both surprised and wary at her appearance. "Tom," she said pleasantly, "I wonder if you might spare me a few minutes. It's about Colin Reeves." The boy's expression grew guarded. "Told the constable everything I know, ma'am." "I'm sure you did, but sometimes when one has time to reflect, other details come to mind. You said you saw Colin looking as though he'd been sleeping rough. Can you remember exactly where you encountered him?" Tom leaned on his pitchfork, considering. "It was up near the old sheepfold, the one on the hill overlooking the quarry. I'd gone up there to check on Aoway that had wandered off. Saw Colin coming out of the trees, looking like he hadn't slept in days, and he ran when he saw you. But before he did, he looked at me like he wanted to say something. Almost called out then, thought better of it, and took off." "When was this exactly?" "September, I think, maybe early October, before the cold weather set in proper." The same time, Miss Marple noted that Colin had been seen talking to the travelling stationer in the village square, the same time he might have purchased expensive wrapping paper. "Tom," she said, "in your opinion, was Colin the sort of young man who would harm Laura Palmer?" The boy's response was immediate and emphatic. "Never in 1,000 years, ma'am. Colin worshipped the ground she walked on, but he knew she was quality, and he wasn't. He'd have cut off his own hand before hurting her." "Then why do you suppose everyone believed they'd run away together?" Tom's face darkened. "'Cause it was easier than looking at the other possibilities, and because Mr. Palmer wanted it to be true. Better a daughter who ran off with a groom than a daughter who'd been—" He stopped. Unable to finish the sentence, Miss Marple thanked him and made her way toward the old sheepfold he'd mentioned. It was a steep climb and she had to stop several times to catch her breath, but eventually she reached the ancient stone structure that had once sheltered shepherds and their flocks. The fold was partly collapsed, but one section remained relatively intact, providing shelter from wind and rain. Inside, Miss Marple found signs of recent habitation: a rough bed made from straw and an old blanket, the remains of a small fire carefully constructed to minimize smoke, a tin cup and a battered kettle, and something else, tucked into a crevice in the stone wall, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from damp, was a small bundle. Miss Marple carefully unwrapped it and found herself looking at a second locket. This one was silver-like, Laura's, but smaller and plainer. She opened it with trembling fingers and found inside a lock of fair hair and a folded piece of paper. The writing was so small that she had to hold it up to the light to read it. "If this reaches you, something has happened greater than trust. Colin, he tried to help, greater than the truth is in thee. Accounts greater than a bee is not who he seems. LP Laura Palmer's final message hidden away for a year in case it was needed." Miss Marple was still staring at the note when she heard movement behind her. She turned to find Colin Reeves standing in the entrance to the fold, his face gaunt and desperate. "Please don't run," she said quietly. "I'm not here to harm you. I'm here to help." He swayed slightly, as if exhausted beyond endurance. Up close, she could see that he was painfully thin, his clothes ragged, his eyes haunted. "You shouldn't have come here," he said hoarsely. It's not safe. Not safe from whom, Colin? From Arthur Briggs. The effect of the name was electric. Colin stumbled backward, his hand going to the wall for support. You know, he whispered. How do you know? I know several things, Miss Marple said gently. I know that Laura discovered Briggs was embezzling from the estate. I know that she planned to confront him and that you tried to dissuade her. I know that something terrible happened at the quarry a year ago. I know that you've been living in fear ever since. Colin's face crumpled. He sank down onto the stone bench, his head in his hands. I tried to save her, he said, his voice breaking. I swear to you I tried. Miss Marple sat down beside him, giving him time to compose himself. When he finally spoke again, the words came out in a rush as if a dam had broken. Laura found discrepancies in the feed invoices, payments being made to suppliers who didn't exist, money disappearing into false accounts. She confronted Briggs about it, thinking he'd made honest mistakes. But he laughed at her, told her she was meddling in matters she didn't understand. And then she said she was going to tell her father to report Briggs to the authorities. Briggs became angry. I was there in the stables and I heard them arguing. I came into the office and told Briggs to leave her alone. Colin's hands clenched into fists. He did leave, but he told Laura that if she spoke to anyone, she'd regret it. So you and Laura decided to leave together? No, Colin shook his head vehemently. I wanted her to come away with me to go to the police in London where Briggs couldn't reach her. But she refused. She said she had to tell her parents the truth first, that it was her duty. She insisted on going home to speak with them. But she never reached home, no. I followed her, keeping my distance, because I knew Mr. Palmer would be furious if he saw me near his daughter. But I wanted to make sure she got home safely. He paused, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. She took the path by the quarry. It was quicker than the road, and Briggs was waiting for her there. Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Tell me what happened. I heard Laura cry out. I ran toward the sound and saw them struggling near the quarry's edge. Briggs had hold of her, arm demanding she'd give him the evidence she'd collected. I shouted and ran at him. We fought. His voice broke. I managed to pull Laura away to push Briggs back. I told Laura to run to get help. She started running back toward her house, and you stayed to fight Briggs. I tried to keep him from following her. We fought near the edge and he fell, knocked his head on a rock. I thought I'd killed him. Colin looked up, his eyes desperate. I panicked. I should have gone for help, but I was terrified. A common groom who'd just attacked his employer's accountant. No one would believe my story. So you ran. Yes, I ran like a coward. I left Briggs lying there and I fled. I didn't know what else to do. Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly. But Laura never reached home. What happened to her, Colin? I don't know. The anguish in his voice was unmistakable. I swear to you I don't know. I thought she had made it safely back. I hid in the woods for days, expecting to hear that Briggs had been found dead and that I was being hunted for murder. But there was nothing, no discovery of a body, no investigation. And then Laura was reported missing. Yes, and everyone said she'd run away with you. But I hadn't seen her since that day at the quarry. I didn't know where she was, whether she was alive or dead. I've been half mad with worry and guilt. Why didn't you go to the police? Colin laughed bitterly. And tell them what? That I fought with Briggs and left him for dead. That Laura disappeared afterwards. I had no idea what became of her. They'd have hanged me for certain. So you've been hiding all this time, living, rough moving from place to place, trying to work out what happened. I went back to the quarry later when I dared. There was no sign of Briggs's body, no blood, no evidence of our fight. It was as if it had never happened, which suggests, Miss Marple said slowly, that Briggs wasn't killed after all that he recovered and removed all traces of the struggle. Colin stared at her. But if he survived, then where is he? Why hasn't anyone seen him? Because, Miss Marple said, he's been hiding, just as you have, but more cleverly. He changed his name, took work somewhere he wouldn't be recognized, and waited to see if anyone would connect him to Laura's disappearance. She showed him the locket she'd found with its hidden message. Colin took it with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face. "She left this for me," he whispered. "In case something happened, she must have hidden it before she confronted Briggs. And you've been trying to bring the truth to light without revealing yourself," Miss Marple said. "The Christmas parcel, the anonymous note to Mr. Palmer, you wanted them to search the quarry to find evidence of what Briggs had done. That had Laura's locket, the one she was wearing that day. I found it later near the quarry. I thought if I sent it to her parents, wrapped like a burial offering, they'd demand a proper investigation. They'd search the quarry and find her." His voice broke on the last word, and Miss Marple understood what he couldn't bring himself to say. That Laura Palmer lay somewhere near that abandoned quarry where she had run for her life a year ago, only to meet a fate that Colin could only imagine with horror. Chapter 10. The Black Ribbon Unraveled. Miss Marple insisted that Colin Reeves accompanied her directly to Inspector Craddock. The young man was terrified, convinced he would be arrested for murder, but she was firm. "The truth is your only protection now," she told him as they made their way down from the sheepfold. "And I suspect that once the inspector hears your account, he will see that you are a witness, not a criminal, Inspector." Craddock was at the Palmer house when they arrived, and his expression upon seeing Colin Reeves was one of profound relief mixed with professional weariness. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "we've been looking for you. I think you better come inside." What followed was a long afternoon of statements and questions. Colin told his story from beginning to end, faltering at times, but never wavering from the essential facts. Mr. Palmer listened in stricken silence while Mrs. Palmer wept quietly into her handkerchief. When Colin finished, Inspector Craddock sat back and considered what he had heard. "So you believe Briggs survived the fight at the quarry," he said, "and that he intercepted Laura after she fled from you?" "I don't know what else to think," Colin said miserably. "She never made it home. I found her locket near the quarry path days later, as if it had been torn from her neck. You wrapped it in funeral paper and sent it to the Palmers on Christmas morning. Yes, I thought if they knew she was dead, if they demanded a proper search, her body would be found, Dan Briggs would be caught. But you see," Miss Marple interjected gently, "there's something that doesn't quite fit. Colin, you said you found the locket days after Laura disappeared, yet you didn't send it to the Palmers until a full year later. Why wait so long?" Colin looked down at his hands. "At first, I was too afraid. Then I realized I needed proof of what Briggs had done. I tried to find him, to track him down. It took me months to discover where he'd gone." "And where was that?" Inspector Craddock asked sharply. "I am not certain," Colin admitted, "but I traced him to Much Benham. He'd taken work under a false name. I couldn't get close enough to be sure it was him, but I saw him from a distance, and I was almost certain. Miss Marple leaned forward. Colin where? In Much Benham. At Henderson's funeral home in Little Marsham, just outside Much Benham proper. I saw a man who looked like Briggs working there, bringing in supplies, but he called himself Henderson now. Said he was the proprietor's nephew. Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple exchanged significant glances. Henderson's Craddock said, "That's one of the funeral homes I sent inquiries to yesterday. I haven't received a response yet." "Then I suggest," Miss Marple said, "that we pay them a visit without delay. If Arthur Briggs has been working there under an assumed name, he will know by now that inquiries have been made. He may attempt to flee within the hour." A police motorcar was carrying Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock, and 2 constables toward Little Marsham. Colin Reeves remained at the Palmer house under the reluctant supervision of Constable Polker, who had been instructed to keep him safe and prevent him from disappearing again. Funeral home was a sombre establishment, on the edge of Little Marsham, a converted house with discreet signage and dark curtains in the windows. Instructed the constables to watch the rear entrance while he and Miss Marple approached the front door. A small, elderly man answered their knock. He introduced himself as Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, and showed them into a quiet parlour that smelled of lilies and furniture polish. "How may I help you?" he asked, his voice professionally subdued. Craddock produced a photograph from the stables. "We're looking for this man. We have reason to believe he may have taken employment here under a false name. His real name is Arthur Briggs." Henderson studied the photograph carefully, then shook his head. "I don't recognize him. I employ only 2 assistants, both local men I've known for years." "What about a nephew?" Miss Marple asked. "Someone who might have helped with supplies or errands?" Henderson frowned. "I have no nephew, madame. My brother died childless. Yet someone was seen here claiming to be your nephew," Craddock pressed. "A man matching Briggs's description." Henderson's frown deepened. "That's impossibly less." He paused, then rose abruptly. "Wait here, please." He disappeared through a door at the back of the parlour. Miss Marple and Craddock could hear him calling, out his voice rising with agitation. Then there was the sound of rapid footsteps, a door slamming and a shout. Craddock was through the door in an instant, with Miss Marple following more slowly. They found themselves in a workroom where coffins in various stages of preparation stood. Against the walls, Henderson was standing by an open back door, looking shaken. "He's gone," he said. "My assistant Trobert Harris. He was here not 5 minutes ago. Now he's fled." "Describe him," Craddock demanded. "Medium height, dark hair going grey, at the temples, quiet manner. He came to me 18 months ago with excellent references. Said he had worked at several funeral homes in the north." Henderson's face paled. Those reference eyes should have verified them more carefully, but he was skilled, knowledgeable land. "I needed the help." "Robert Harris," Miss Marple murmured. "Or Arthur Briggs. The initials are even the same. A small vanity, perhaps, simply easier to remember." One of the constables appeared at the back door, breathing hard. He went over the back fence, heading toward the train station. "After him," Craddock ordered, "and telephone ahead to the station. I want that train stopped." The constables departed at a run. Craddock turned back to Henderson. "Show me where Harris worked, his desk, and his belongings. Anything that might tell us where he planned to go." Henderson led them to a small office off the workroom. It was neat and sparsely furnished with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a narrow cot in the corner. On the desk lay several sheets of expensive wrapping paper and a spool of black silk ribbon. Miss Marple picked up the ribbon and examined it. The same quality as what wrapped Laura's locket. And here, see how it's been cut and tied. Several practice knots all in the funeral style. Craddock was going through the desk drawers. Here's something, a ticket stub from the Much Benham to London train dated today. He was planning to leave because he knew your inquiries would eventually lead here. The moment you started asking questions about funeral homes and men matching Briggs's description, his time was up. But why did he send the locket at all? Henderson asked, bewildered. Why draw attention to himself? Because, Miss Marple said quietly, I don't believe he did send it. I believe Colin Reeves sent it hoping to force an investigation. But Briggs saw what happened and knew his time was running out. That's why he planned to flee today. They were interrupted by one of the constables returning, accompanied by a tall man in railway uniform. We've stopped the London train, sir, the constable reported, and we found this gentleman on the platform. Says he saw a man matching Briggs's description board the train just before we arrived. The railway man nodded. I saw him, nervous-looking fellow, kept glancing over his shoulder. Bought a ticket to London at the last minute. Craddock moved decisively. Right, we're going to search that train carriage by carriage. He won't get far. The train was still standing at the platform when they arrived, much to the frustration of the passengers. Craddock boarded with his constables and began a systematic search, starting at the front and working backward. They found Arthur Briggs in the fourth carriage, sitting in a corner seat with a newspaper held up before his face. When Craddock approached, Briggs made a desperate lunge for the window, but the constables were too quick. Within moments, he was in handcuffs, his face white and his eyes darting frantically for escape. Arthur Briggs, Craddock said formally, I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Laura Palmer. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence. Briggs said nothing, but Miss Marple, watching him carefully, saw the moment when his resistance crumbled. His shoulders sagged. A look of weary resignation settled over his features. Back at the police station in Much Benham with a solicitor, Present Briggs finally spoke. Didn't mean to kill her, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. I only wanted to frighten, hurt, to make her understand that she needed to keep quiet about the accounts. But she ran from me and I chased her. When I caught up to her near the sea quarry, she fought and scratched my face, tried to scream. I grabbed her locket to pull her back and the chain broke, and then, Craddock prompted. She lost her balance, felt her head on a rock. Briggs closed his eyes. She was dead within moments. There was nothing I could do, so you hid her body. Yes, near the quarry, in a hollow under some fallen logs and brambles. I covered it with branches and leaves. Then I removed all trace of what had happened and left the area. Took a new identity. I couldn't stay in St. Mary Mead. Too many people knew me. But I couldn't leave the county entirely, not with the embezzled money still in accounts I needed to access. So I became Robert Harrison, took work at Henderson's. It was perfect. No one looks twice at a funeral home. Assistant tanned, I learned skills that proved useful. The funeral knot, Miss Marple said. You used it when wrapping the locket that Colin Reeves sent. But you didn't send the locket yourself, did you? Briggs looked at her with something like respect. No, that fool Reeves sent it thinking he was so clever. But it brought the police sniffing around, asking questions. I knew it was only a matter of time before they traced me. Inspector Craddock stood. Arthur Briggs, you'll be charged with the murder of Laura Palmer and with embezzlement from Enbury Estate. A search party will be organised immediately to recover Miss Palmer's remains. The search took place the following morning. Miss Marple did not accompany the party, but she heard later that Laura Palmer's body had been found exactly where Briggs had described, preserved by the cold and hidden beneath the years' worth of fallen leaves and undergrowth. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage with a cup of tea, watching the winter darkness gather outside her window. She thought of Laura Palmer, young woman who had died trying to do what was right. She thought of Colin Reeves, who had lived in torment for a year, believing himself guilty of cowardice. And she thought of the Palmers who would finally be able to grieve properly now that they knew the truth. Inspector Craddock called later to tell her that Colin had been cleared of all suspicion and that the Palmers had asked him to stay at their house until he found his feet again. They blamed themselves, Craddock said, for not believing in their daughter, for accepting the easiest explanation rather than searching for the truth. Guilt is a heavy burden, Miss Marple observed. But perhaps in time they will find that understanding the truth, however painful, is better than living with comfortable lies. After the inspector left, Miss Marple sat in her chair by the fire, her knitting in her lap, thinking about the case, the black ribbon that had been tied with such care around her daughter's last possession, the message it had sent as clear as words. This is a funeral offering, a memorial to the dead. Colin Reeves had meant it as an accusation, a way to force the truth into the light. But in doing so, he had succeeded beyond his intentions. The ribbon had unravelled the whole sorry tale, pulling tight at the end to reveal what had been hidden for so long. Truth, Miss Marple murmured to herself, echoing the words she had spoken to the Palmers days earlier. Like a ribbon may be twisted 100 ways, but it always pulls tight at the end. And outside, the winter night settled over St. Mary Mead, cold, clear and quiet once more.